Much, Jubin. Delighted to join you. Great to be part of this important event, and congratulations on all of you. And I want to acknowledge Clementina Acedo, Maribel O'Neill, yourself, Jubin, and René Schegg on this occasion. Very welcome to panel 1 on the role of education on women's empowerment and mobilization. You mentioned it, Jubin. We have an impressive list of speakers with Ms. Salma Al-Nims, Ms. Fatima Sadiki, Ms. Asma Mustafa, Ms. Randa Signora, and Mr. Fauzi Murji. So I'll be looking very much forward to those contributions. One of the slightly less enviable roles, of course, of the moderator, and albeit very necessary, is to ensure the timekeeping. So we will try and stay within the 12 to 15 minute mark for each of the contributions, because I think any of us who has ever been on a panel also looks forward very much to the questions that are raised by the attendees. So I will be playing that role. I think we are all aware of how important education is in general, and education for girls is in particular. And I must say that that was my greatest discovery in my work with UNRWA, to see the energy, courage, passion that was invested by hundreds of thousands of students, in particular female students, in claiming their right to education, but also investing in their education under very, very difficult circumstances. Now, of course, we are aware that the topic of education, the topic of youth empowerment, mobilization, and the topic of women's empowerment and mobilization is at the center of many discussions in government, multilateral institutions, international organizations, grassroots activism. The topic is about access to education, equal access to education, but also very much the type and quality of education. And I think to understand the parameters that possibly negatively impact the education and the possibilities for girls to obtain access and quality education are parameters that are very important for us to understand as well as possible. And here there may be patriarchal power structures, conflict dynamic, gender inequalities, discrimination, but also, of course, the current effects of the COVID epidemic. These are all topics that I think our speakers, in various ways, based on their very important experience, will be addressing, and I suggest we get right into it. And I turn to the first speaker and wish to welcome Ms. Salma Al-Nims, who is currently the Secretary General of the Jordanian National Commission for Women's Affairs, a very distinguished professional journey, but also educational background that you can see from the summary that has been provided. I do want to flag that Salnims, apart from her important current leadership roles, has also received the Said Foundation Outstanding Achievement Prize in 2019, which is awarded to individuals who have contributed significantly to the development of the region. So without further ado, Ms. Salnims, I do hand over the floor to you for this first intervention.
Thank you so much, Pierre. And I would like to start by thanking the Webster University and the MENA Center for Peace and Development for giving me this amazing opportunity. And I find it very difficult to speak after the very inspiring keynote speech by Professor Huda, but actually, I would like you to keep that speech in context as I talk about education in the MENA region generally, and I will focus more on the issue of education in Jordan. I want to start with the MENA region just to highlight that we cannot look at the education of girls in the MENA region and give it a one general statement. We know that the disparity has been there even before the occupations, the conflicts, and the civil wars that are tearing apart the MENA region and its society. But as the conflict increases, we know that lots of women in many countries in the region has lost their winning in terms of education, putting aside the political issues and liberties. So we know that now we need to actually ask a real question about how much investment is putting into peace, peace building, stopping wars, in comparison to all this discussion about education and gender equality. We will not be able to achieve gender equality without political reforms or with the continuing occupation and conflict in our region. However, I want to go to the Jordanian situation. In the 1950s, of course, and in the Jordanian constitution, education became a right to all, and it was the primary education. However, the Jordanians at the time, and in the 50s, we had for a very short while a democratic government that was pulled apart, put aside, and we adopted martial laws. However, education was seen by the regime as an important tool and for development, and that women should be educated. However, if we look at the tendency of the education from the 50s further on, mainly the focus was on educating women as a way of establishing the right family, that the family should, an educated mother would make a better family. And we would see that the tendency after that in terms of employment would be going to education and healthcare. So it was basically education was, and economic participation after that was reinforcing the image of the nurturing image of women only, and it wasn't, and it was seen as something beneficial for the family, and the jobs that should be taken should be always appropriate and aligned with the main family responsibilities. And before establishing the University of Jordan at the end, towards the end of the 60s, mainly on those who were in political party, fathers who were in political parties would send their daughters, some of them, to study law and actually medicine in the USSR or in Iraq and Syria. So we had some few women who were getting like more outside of the usual educational form. And those women, many of them have become actually in the center of the women movement, especially from the left political parties. However, we have to ask as I said, we have to ask ourselves, what kind of education did we offer? We, starting the 70s towards the 90s, we also had the influx and the relation between political Islam and the regime. And that relation and the balance between how far they would go in asking for political reform in comparison to asking for social, their influence on the social side of the society, basically their influence on the education was the strongest. So the curriculum were started to go further and further till the 70s, where they were more affected by the nationalist and left tendencies, and then the influx and the infiltration of political Islam into the Ministry of Education affected the whole curriculum, and the curriculum held very strong division of roles, of gender roles, and further religion became found not only in Arabic, but you would find it even in examples in math, in science, and it was focused specifically. It was very important to continue to control women inside the family sphere, as Dr. Huda said. So basically, it didn't create, the educational system was not creating any revolutionary approach towards or looking at equality in its all terms. Something else about education with that is that Jordanians themselves, we have to see why are they educating their daughters? Of course, it differs. Jordanians are not one homogeneous group, but it differs from one family to another, from poor areas to rich areas. But still, we would see that because families, about how do we perceive the role of men in society, men were seen and still are being seen as the main breadwinners, the ones who are going to have to get married, spend on their families, on their parents. So parents would invest on their higher education of their male children, even if they barely passed in their higher school education. So on the other side, girls, if they did not access the public universities competitively, they would know their parents would stop investing in their education, because they don't find that this is an important investment. She should be going and getting married. So we would see that actually girls are now outperforming male young men in their performance in the high school degrees, which we call the secondary, the Tawjih degree, and even in the universities, because they have to do it competitively. They know that they will not be able to convince their parents to sell a piece of land to do that. So again, we see that we're not only affecting, this approach is not only affecting women, it's also affecting how men are being raised, how they are efficient, and they are in the end going forward and contributing to building the institutions that we are talking about, because they are mainly the ones who are hired in high positions. And again, I will just try to wrap up by talking about the paradox of high education versus low political participation. We have been investing in education, investing in even women, economic participation, yet it is very low till today. That's because we have never looked at, and that's talking about changing our strategies, how social and gender roles are affecting women's choices to go into the labor force. Not to mention that economic violence is still there, whether her inability to control her own money within the family and be able to make decisions over this money, or the discrimination in the private sector, and that she is not even getting her rights and the salary. And we have to remember how the personal status law is affecting that. Men, husbands, have still the right to not deny their wives to work. They can deny her allowance if she works without his consent. She still has to get his approval to get out of the house. Of course, not everyone does that, but actually in the law, in the personal status law, this affects women. This means that all this investment, without looking at how the relations in the private sphere and the dynamics in them, then all this investment will not lead to anything. I will finish with what's happening in COVID. Women are now, the distance learning, the quality and the disparity of access to quality education is increasing. In public schools, women are not, girls are basically not able to, some of them are not accessing the platforms, the government platforms. This means that women in poorer areas are going to become more marginalized, and we expect to see an increase in child marriage this year, which is one of the problems that we are facing in Jordan. So I think we need to look at this. We cannot look at education and all of this investment and the numbers of closing the gender gaps in the WEF reports means nothing if we do not look into the internal dynamics of these issues and see how they are affecting the issue of real access and power over their lives and decisions for women. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Salma, for the very, I think, clear presentation, very powerful messages on setting education into the context of all the challenges and parameters that affect it. And you have illustrated it from the Jordanian example, but I think there are many of your points that have regional and more global implications, which I think is very welcome in that regard. So many thanks for that. We will turn now to the second presentation in this panel by Professor Fatma Sadiki, who is a senior professor of linguistics and gender studies at the Sidi Mohammed bin Abdullah University in Fez, Morocco. You're also the president of the Association of Middle East Women's Studies, which I think is a very important institution. We're delighted to have you with us, Fatma, and I give you the floor.
Thank you very much indeed. Given the constraints of time, I want to use a PowerPoint. Do you see it?
We do, yes.
Yeah, okay. Well, first of all, let me start by thanking very warmly the organizers and the moderator. Thank you for the nice words. And as I said, given the time limits, I'm going to focus on a specific issue, and that's the role of higher education in the promotion of women's rights in the Arab world. Let me start by saying that, as you all know, education is very crucial in empowering women in the Arab world. In higher education, this empowerment is manifested in the creation of graduate programs. I chose this because I was involved in the creation of one of those programs. This creation process started in the last decade of the 20th century, and it became a genuine phenomenon in the 21st century, especially in the post-uprisings era. Now, of course, the reason is that more and more women from various class backgrounds reached the university and started to reflect on their status and ways of improving it on the academic level. Most of these women, by the way, are most of them are activists and some of them are politicians. So in the Arab world, in the MENA region in general, women who are engaged in feminist discourse or feminist activism are also, most of them are university professors, not all of them, but most of them. Okay. Now, the main topics that are studied in these programs, as you can see, range over different things, from politics to violence, to Islamic discourse, to economy, to media, to rights, science, philosophy, just name it. Now, these topics are very much related to the areas of specialization of the teachers themselves, and also to the possibilities, the potentialities, the potential possibilities in the institution. Okay. Now, the main goals of these programs are many. First and foremost, they aim at challenging traditional modes of thinking about men and women. We all know that this is one of the most important issues, and that has been directly or indirectly underlined by the previous speakers. Challenging that. That's the mentalities. The second one is to reclaim the role of women in knowledge production and knowledge construction, because up to very recently, most university syllabi in the Arab world, and some of them are still like that, have been articulated mainly from a male perspective. And another aim is to work on feminist concepts and terminology, and also work on women's legacy, try to underline those legacies in order to prepare for future agencies. Sorry. Then there is this very important aim, which bridges the gap between the university and civil society, because in women's and gender programs, very important to have this this gap bridged. Create networks of institutions and partnerships, not only with European and African institutions, but sometimes beyond, with the aim of improving institutional policies, social actions, and agenda for improving women's rights. And we can see this, I mean, very easily in what's happening, and I think this forum is one example of that. Prepare students for a wide variety excuse me, of professional careers. Some of them are prepared to be consultants in local NGOs, national government NGOs, and international development agencies. These are only examples. And of course, research, fieldwork, surveys. By the way, what I am saying here is based on a survey that I conducted between 2017 and 2019 on the university programs of women's and gender studies in the Arab world, from Palestine to Morocco. Okay, in sum, what these programs aim at is to democratize higher education. At least this was our case in Morocco when we started it. some kind of democratization in the horizon, promote the concept of equality between sexes, and build institutions, because people come and go, but institutions stay. Attract male and female students, and also enhance interdisciplinarity. There are, of course, I mean, all of us come from fundamental disciplines, but these programs go across that. One important thing I want to share with you here, and an important thing which transpired from the survey, is that there are important and poorly known differences between North Africa and the Middle East. I hate these dichotomies, but we have to work with them. I struggled with them in my life, but North Africa sometimes includes Egypt, sometimes not, and the rest of the Middle East. Now, 4 important things there that are important for the programs. First, language, the language issue. English is predominant in the Middle East, whereas French and Arabic are more so in North Africa. And this impacts the program. Second, the religious aspect. Now, in the Middle East, generally with Islam, Christianity, Judaism, they compete in a way or another. I don't want to go into that. But in North Africa, we are predominantly Islam. Islam is the predominant religion. Ethnicity. The Middle East is predominantly Arab, whereas in North Africa, especially the Maghreb, is more multi-ethnic with the rising Amazigh identity. Then identity. Arabic is more related to identity in the Middle East than North Africa, where multilingualism is more accepted and assumed, less threatening. This is based on interviews that I had with the leaders of the program during the survey. So more things there. There are more publications by teachers and students in the Middle East than in North Africa. That's true, although the gap is being gradually filled by more knowledge production in North Africa. On the other hand, there's more gender mixture in North Africa, especially the Maghreb, whether in relation to the ratio of female students or that of female staff than in the Middle East. This may be due to the fact that women's legal rights, as has been mentioned, were historically part of state building rhetoric in these countries, especially in the Maghreb, and Tunisia is the most important example there. In the Middle East, these programs started in private universities, whereas in North Africa, they started in public universities. That's also, I mean, I don't have time to go into the ramifications of what that means. The programs in private university in general are more structured. I looked at they have websites, for example, and they are more connected nationally and internationally than the programs in public universities. The Middle Eastern programs are more geared towards nationalism or big movements. Palestine is an example, very good program there, than in North Africa, where our programs in the region are more geared towards the family laws and gender equality. Although all programs lack funding, there is a difference. Private universities are more funded. We have one program in one private university in Morocco, and it is more funded. The situation is more complicated in public universities, where the management of funds is more centralized and less in the hands of the leaders of the program. Again, based on interviews. As a result of these differences, the academic gender programs are more integrated in the university curricula and more accepted in North Africa than in the Middle East. Indeed, in spite of the higher female literacy in the Middle East than in North Africa, the latter region has older family codes and more frequent reforms of the codes. For example, the Tunisian family code that banned polygamy, well, its banning of polygamy dates back to 56. Our own 2004 reforms of the Moroccan codes are substantial in that they stipulate equality in the age of marriage, etc. This is my conclusion. There are challenges. These challenges vary according to countries. The first challenge is lack of visibility. And in my opinion, this lack of visibility hides a rising tone of feminist contestations in academia. Okay. The second challenge is lack of funding, which often precludes the creation of potential for agency, such as engagement with combating violence against women. The third one is resistance of some fundamental disciplines to recognize gender and women's studies, MAs and PhDs. Last is the institutionalization of gender and equality in the Arab countries. That's another challenge which needs more time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Fatima. There are some important topics that you've raised there that definitely deserve follow-up questions, and I'm sure that the participants will have several of those. I also take the opportunity to flag that, of course, questions can be listed in the chat box, which will allow us later to distribute them to the different speakers. So I really want to thank you for that substantial intervention and how you broke down these different parameters for us to take into consideration and to analyze. That's been very, very useful indeed. Thank you. I will turn now and give the floor to our third speaker, Asma Mustafa, who is a teacher of English language in the Gaza Strip and has been so for the past 13 years. You were also recently awarded the Global Teacher Award, which is another sign of Palestine's commitment and engagement on inclusive and quality education, both in the West Bank and East Jerusalem and in the Gaza Strip. It is always important to hear the perspectives from Gaza. And so, Ms. Mustafa, you have the floor. I hope you can connect and hear me well. So I pass the floor to you.
First of all, let me thank you, Mr. Perry, and I'd like to thank the organizers for this conference. Many thanks for the invitation. I'm here to speak about the role of education and women empowerment. I'm sharing my screen. Is it clear?
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Okay. Briefly, I'm going to tell my story in education as a teacher of English. But first, let me say good morning. Good morning to the soldiers who share men in building the communities, and the women who share in making minds, the women who share in movements, the women who prepare the future leaders. This is Asma Mustafa, the English language teacher from Palestine. To my warm regards and appreciation, and the Global Teacher Award winner 2020. And my story began 12 years ago. A student expressed her feeling towards some gaming activities I was doing inside my classrooms. She stood up and said, Mrs. Esma, I'd like to say something, and I gave her the opportunity to speak freely. She said, I'm so happy as I have never bought a toy. My dad does not work, and we are 11 brothers and sisters inside a very, very small, of 2 small rooms. She continued, I have also never visited the city of Gaza, which is on in my house. This means much to me, and this was my start. It took me a long time of hard work and researching and educational games could be activated in teaching English as a foreign language. Year after year, I developed my sketches in teaching English by my 45 innovative games, short stories, songs, drama, and I managed to change my English teaching English style from the traditional ones into the best. They are now waiting eagerly for the English classes. I also have launched my global educational project in December 2019 I believe I can fly. This is what I do believe in my students' abilities, that they can do it and they can speak freely. They are the center of change, actually, because we are preparing leaders for the future. We are making the mind activities of this project later on enabled my students to speak via Zoom and Skype to their peers from 35 different countries around the world. I managed to join the BBC and Pearson Live Classes project from London. The Hands Up project English by short stories. The word peace sung in Japan. We are brothers and sisters sung I the whole word into my small, modest classrooms. I taught my students to sing, to tell a story, to make microdrama after reading or watching an English short story, for example. They even can now tell their own stories in their daily life in English, and they can connect with their peers from different countries. They also have learned how to write letters and the words some letters about their lives, their culture, country, and their schools too. They have learned how to use technology in an engaged way. They have learned how to be good researchers, how to paint on the walls, how to enjoy learning life, and how to, use their free time in doing good things. Mentors taught them how to think critically and to express their feelings, thoughts, and how to make decisions. My students unfortunately didn't just say no if they wanted to say no. Now they can politely say no or say yes. They learned how to solve problems they may face in their real lives. They built more confidence, self-confidence as they traveled virtually. Because we're living under the siege since 2008 till now, and we cannot travel. It's very hard to get out of Gaza Strip, which lets us know they traveled virtually instead of reality, and they managed to talk to many peers and teachers from all around the world freely. I can't deny that the beginning was very, very difficult for my female students who have never traveled abroad, strangers, as their families say. They are strangers in some part of the rural life culture in some camps here in Palestine, never talk to strangers. But teachers can lead this, and we can put them in the first step to talk freely, to learn, and to connect with others. Life is, good, but we have to manage how to get benefits. I want to be led very well by an adult. This is what I was doing. My students now in the 10th grade were born as a strip. They were born in 2005, and this was the start of this siege. So they are living a miserable life, you can say. Gaza has some privacy in life as a result of this siege, forcing 2 million people in this very small area caused by troubles like the electricity cut off for 16 hours a day, or 16 continuing hours actually. And this 16 hours in cases, and I'm so lucky today. It's the time to be connected with electricity in the conference time, and they forced me to bring my own laptop to schools every day with full battery charge in order to continue working. There's no technical problems at all, so that my students could learn how to solve their problems and how to provide themselves critical in general. Large numbers of students, which reaches to 47 or 50 students in one classroom, sometimes make it harder for teachers to give all the learners the same opportunity of being involved in the classroom's activity. And that's why I use the group work to solve this problem. It was very hard at the very beginning, since 12 or 13 years, but now I managed with the large numbers. I taught my students to adapt with this difficult situation, hard life, comparing children's lives in the world. They can think now how to change the obstacles to be tops to fly. They have learned to be optimistic and to help each other, to cooperate, to make problems very solid, nice, and good girls. They have also learned to smile all the time and to be shining like and now in COVID-19 pandemic time, mass school is classified as one of the most dangerous areas in hundreds of cases between students inside a school. So I meet my two groups Hangouts meet the application of Google Classroom so that we could mainly meet each other, keep in touch, learn, and sometimes in this very difficult time. My students are sending you their love and best wishes. This opportunity to speak briefly about the education and the teacher's role in empowerment. Yes, I work with young learners, but those young learners, unfortunately, most of them get married since early time. And at the very beginning of my experience, I was single, but I was students, they were 14, 15 years, and I was 22, 23. I was single and they were married. This is one of the most important problems for me to be solved. Many of my students now started thinking about to go on learning and continue educational, continue university studying maybe. One day, I could change their thinking into the better. This is the teachers. This is my best that I can do. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. And yes, Mr. Ferry.
Asma, thank you so much. We're very proud to have you on this panel. And I have to say that what you have described just deserves a lot of recognition and respect, because I think, your presentation was very modest on the difficulties that you face. I think anybody who understands and sees the situation of Gaza has to understand how many pressures you deal with: conflict, occupation, the lack of horizon, the lack of freedom of movement, and of course the repeated conflicts. And your students have experienced that as well. And so to be able to keep education so central to your effort and to keep your positive energy flowing in the way that you have just described, I think so compellingly, is something that should inspire anybody who faces difficulties in life to think that there is always a way to find solutions. And I think what you're doing for the students and these young girls is incredibly important. So we really want to pay tribute to your daily work, and it's been beautifully recognized, of course, with the Global Teacher Award. Thank you so much for your points, and I'm sure we'll have follow-up questions for you. We're of course very lucky that indeed electricity allowed us to have you connect at this very moment. Thank you very much, Asma. And I turn now to our fourth speaker, Ms. Randa Signora. Randa, you're the Director General of the Women's Center for Legal Aid and Counseling in Jerusalem. You're a distinguished activist on human and women's rights. You have served in other organizations such as the Al-Haq Human Rights Organization and also the Independent Commission for Human Rights in Palestine. You also addressed the UN Security Council in October 2018, notably on the issues of domestic violence and femicide in the occupied territories. It's a pleasure to give you the floor, Randa.
Good morning to everyone, and thank you very much, Pierre, for this nice introduction. I want to thank Webster University and the MENA Center for inviting me today. I'm privileged to be with you today. And I'm very lucky to be after Asma, because Asma gave me the positive energy to continue in my presentation, which reflects the realities, the difficult realities under blockade in the Gaza Strip, but still the very optimistic approach to addressing the young children learning from such a marvelous and wonderful educator like Asma, who tries to develop her approach in education. Definitely education to Palestinians is one of the key issues and important introduction to every aspect of the Palestinian life. And definitely education to Palestinian girls and women is a very important tool for proceeding in their lives in the occupied Palestinian territory. The situation in Palestine should be understood in the context of its complexity, the complexity of this situation, which is related to living in a society very similar to the Arab region in the Middle East and North Africa, with having many patriarchal structures very much entrenched in our culture and in our social lives. But at the same time, living under occupation, we have not passed the difficulties of colonial occupation, which is really impacting every aspect of the Palestinian lives, including those of women. From our evidence-based data as a Palestinian women's feminist organization, we document the gendered impact of the occupation on every aspect of Palestinian life, including the right to education and the right to health and so on. The complexity of the situation comes from the very fact that the occupied territory is still under occupation. Some areas are under the control of the Palestinian Authority, but there are a lot of areas like the definitions that are being given to area A, B, and C in the old, with Palestinian Authority only in control of the area A, but then there are a lot of areas that are completely still under the control of the Israeli occupation, for example, area C, and H1 and H2 in the old city of Hebron, and the illegal annexation of East Jerusalem, which makes the reality very much divided, with Gaza being under complete blockade, impacting negatively on all aspects of life, but on education specifically. Despite all of that, and despite the lack of infrastructures and the lack of facilities, the level of education among girls in the Palestinian society are still high. 22% of the Palestinian women finish their education. And this is, the comparison is that in Gaza, it's higher, 45% of the women, 45.2%, while in the West Bank, it's 36.6%. And among the university graduates, 65% of those who are university graduates are women, which means that women do really continue with their education, but this is really not reflecting on the labor market, where women still are not attracted by or are not being empowered by getting into the labor market, because in our society, the early marriage problem and marrying the children is still a major problem, and the complexity of the occupation, with the restrictions of movement, and with the difficulties entailed with women moving, and the fear of the families of their daughters to move freely between the different locations because of the occupation and settler violence, leads to many of them a higher level of dropouts from schools and early marriage to girls, preventing them from pursuing their life, their professional life, or entering into the labor market. Only 19% of the Palestinian women are in the official labor market. Of course, this raises up to 25% if we take the informal sector. And despite that, we think that the education that Palestinian women gain is not really impacting or empowering them in changing the social norms and the social patriarchal structures under which they live, which really are preventing them from pursuing their careers and their professional lives the way we wish them to do. This should be understood or taken into consideration that, for example, in a report that we did in Jerusalem on access to education for girls and women in Jerusalem, we found that the restrictions imposed by the occupation on movements and the isolation of the city of Jerusalem has negatively impacted the ability of women to continue or pursue their secondary education or to go to universities. The division of the occupied territory between the West Bank and the isolation of Jerusalem also increased the sufferings of women from practicing their life. Every aspect of life in the occupied territory entails that you have to look at how the patriarchal structures, together with the colonial occupation, interplay with each other, resulting in a multi-layer oppression to which Palestinian girls and women are being suffering, while all the Palestinian population living under a prolonged military occupation are suffering from the violations of their rights with the grave breaches of international humanitarian law and the violations of international human rights law. The Palestinian girls and women have to suffer all the aspects of the house demolition, restrictions of movement, and the child arrest. You know, many of the children are denied the right to education in Jerusalem, for example, because they are house arrested, and the women have to abandon their jobs in order to take care of the children and to ensure that they do not leave the house, where they become the prison guards of their own children. This really entails a lot of complications to the lives of Palestinian women who have to endure the sufferings of the occupation. In the Gaza Strip, the infrastructures with the cutoff of electricity, with the highly populated society, with the too many with a young generation, youth, mostly from the youth, who are entering into the dropout of children from schools is relatively still high, because the boys leave for the labor market, while girls for economic hardships, and the families first giving up the right of women to education compared with that of boys. So the dropout reasons are different for boys and girls in our society, but the result is that they are denied the right to education due to the limited resources, to the continued occupation, the blockade imposed, and the patriarchal Palestinian structures that are negatively impacting the lives of Palestinian women. Despite that, we think that Palestinian women's contribution to the national struggle to end a prolonged military occupation, and their involvement and engagement in all aspects of Palestinian life, economy, social life, calling for ending of gender-based violence, and trying to do all what we can to adopt policies and legislation within the limited space that we have, still being under occupation, gives hope that the feminist Palestinian women's movement is moving in the right direction to address some of the sufferings of Palestinian women in the curriculum. The gender parity and the discrimination in our curriculum is another problem which we address. The continued rates of discrimination in all aspects of the educational system due to the lack of policies that are addressing the discriminatory curriculums that we are still there, all together with fighting against gender-based violence that has increased further during COVID-19 and further exacerbated the sufferings of Palestinian women because of the caregiving roles that have been imposed on them. Despite all these challenges, I think the Palestinian women are determined to continue with their own struggle at the national level and at the social level to end the gender discrimination and end this prolonged military occupation. Thank you very much.
Shanda, thank you very much. Very important points, these interconnections that you described and the overlapping layers of pressures between the patriarchal parameters and the parameters of occupation. I think that really gives a lot to think about. And I have to say that when you think about how occupation impacts the lives of young students and young girls in particular at many of the checkpoints that they have to go through in order to access the school at the other side. Sometimes when we discuss occupation, the word has been used now for so many years that people become a little bit numb to it. You know, it sounds like something abstract. And I just want to emphasize here that it is nothing abstract. And one way of thinking about it is that the occupation began in 1967. So I was born in 1966, and I can remember what I was able to do in my young life, growing up, going to school, the travel, and later on, of course, my first professional experiences and everything. Each and every one of us can list what happened in our lives. If I had been born in Jenin, in East Jerusalem, in Hebron, or in Jericho, I would have lived almost my entire life under occupation. And I think that's a way maybe of removing the abstraction of the terminologies somewhere. And I think you did a very, very good contribution to us understanding the implications of that. So I want to thank you for that very sincerely. I'd like now to turn to our final speaker, Professor Fawzi Mourji. You are Professor of Econometrics at the Université Hassan II in Casablanca, and you have played various roles also as a former member of the Moroccan Finance Minister's Cabinet. You were engaged with different academic institutions also in Europe, and of course have published a great deal on a number of topics that go to international development, but also other issues of that nature. And it's a pleasure to have you on this panel, Professor, and I'd like to hand the floor to you now.
Thank you very much, Pierre, for this presentation. Thank you for the organizer for inviting me. I have a PowerPoint presentation. I tried to share it. This presentation, this communication was prepared by me and two colleagues. So I have many statistics to share, and I will try to be synthetic as possible. Do you have the presentation on the screen?
No, we can't see it for the moment. At least I cannot, but maybe.
Let me try to share it again.
Now we have it, yes. Yes, you can go ahead. Thank you.
So the colleague are Raja Tuzani and Abdel Jawad Israeli. Our objective is to use some tools of economic science to describe and analyze the situation of the women and the opportunities for fulfillment offered to them in Morocco before and during the COVID crisis. And the second point of our presentation is focused on the importance of education. And we will try to show how it is one of the most indicators and manifestations of gender disparity and else vector of their perpetuations. Here we see that the disparity begin in the first age of the population. I mean, we have the unequal schooling of children in 2014, it's better than in 2004, you see, but there is still more than 10 points difference in percentage of net rate of schooling. What we can see also is that the dropout continues to be more important for girls than for boys. At the end of the day, we have different illiteracy of adult, and you see that in urban we have 31% analphabet in the urban area, compared to 14% for male and 60% in rural area. We see also that women's situation remains rather precarious in Morocco, unequal degree according to the area of residence. The synthetic idea is that the situation is more bad in rural than in urban area, but it's interesting to mention that there is some improvement. For example, the creation of Dar al-Umuma, which objective is to accommodate women living in rural area for to improve the condition. What I want to say also is about the situation in against health. Employed working women are in 4 of 5 cases without medical cover, so it limits the access to care. And women suffer more than men from non-communicable disease. The prevalence, for example, in diabetes is 8% compared to about 6% for male. In hypertension is 13 compared versus 60.9. I also think that it's interesting to talk about the violence. Alors, the victims of this violence suffer from injuries and psychological problems within the public space. And working place 6%, and the statistics of 2019 shows us that mostly is of violence is in houses, 65%. We can note also that this problem increase with the level of poverty and decrease with the elevation of the level of education. With this slide, we show the labor market participation by gender. So the rate of participation of women is low. In urban, it's something like 20%. In rural is more better, but it's low with low value added because it's in essentially in agriculture. So I don't want to explain what was said before, to explain that these questions are linked to the sociological, cultural, which explain this smaller participation of women in the labor market. We see here that when if we compare the rate participation by gender and the marital matrimonial statute, we see that when the ladies are divorced, their participation is more important. 46%, compared to the married, for whom the rate is only 24%. If we think about this participation to the labor market, I think that synthetically we can say that education constitutes the best corrective factors against discrimination, because the rate attains 79% among women with postgraduate degree and 63% among college graduates. If we look at the division of labor and women's time allocation, we see that it's linked, for example, to the husband's activity, and the domestic time, I mean the time devoted to working at home is 5 hours when the husband is working, but only 1 hour and a half when the husband is not active. By the way, the professional time is more important in this case. I want to go to the, just to say that the probability of falling into poverty is less for male-led than for a female-led household. It's coming from study that we did a few years before. What we have to remember, points to remember, health and schooling at early ages are unequal, difference endowments as adult, and differential positions of men and women in the labor market. I want to come to the topics of the forum, more I think more interesting for everyone. And I can share the presentation if you find it interesting. I mean, for the statistics. What we see here is that the duration of the time allocated to household by gender, we see that for female, it's more important than for male, 4 hours compared to a little bit more than half hour. And we can note also that there is 90% of men contribute for the first time to help kids in their studies. What we see also is the impact of the sanitary crisis on education. What we see is that girls give more time to study than boys, but during the crisis they had to work more for a household, so the difference between girls and boys was smaller.
Dr. Mourji, I'm sorry, but we are running a little bit short on time for your presentation. Can I ask you to wrap up in the next minute or so?
Alors, I will go to the conclusion if you prefer.
Thank you.
This is about this situation of the labor market. The crisis of COVID has a big impact for women than for men. I'm sorry if I go so quickly. In conclusion, the COVID pandemic has worsened gender inequalities at different states of age, less access to education and health, and also in the labor market, in the work and access to revenue. Sorry for the maybe not clear presentation.
Thank you very much for all the background elements that you provided, the insights and the way of backing up many of the topics with the statistics, the data, and certainly the important research that you've conducted with your team. I now invite any of the participants or people present attending the conference to raise any of the questions that you might have and points that you would like to follow up on with any of the speakers. So you, of course, can either signal that by raising your hand or texting or typing the comments into the chat box. I maybe just to start, while people are reflecting on possible questions, to address one follow-up question, first of all, to Salma Nibs on your presentation, if you're still with us at this point. The investment in peace that you highlighted is one important aspect. I think you said at the outset of your presentation that investing in peace and security, without that investment in the region of the Middle East, a few things will improve in a sustainable way in terms of justice, equality, and certainly also improved access to education and a connection to access to the labor market and changing of mindsets. What is your sense of how the broader international community is engaging with the Middle East on those issues? Because there is a strong focus on education. There's a strong focus on women's empowerment. What else would you be expecting from an international community perspective to actually be supportive of the actions that you're taking and the developments that are needed in the region?
Thank you, Pierre, for this follow-up question. And basically, we know that also there is a strong, there is a strong tendency at the global level to also revisit how far we have gone in the implementation of the UNSCR 1325 on women, peace, and security. And many of the countries in Arab region have adopted their own national plans for implementation. And some of them have, like Jordan, have secured funding for the implementation for that. But many other countries are suffering, first of all, because of lack of funding and because of the contradiction between the realities on the ground. You feel that how can you work towards implementation of your national action plans for women, peace, and security when the whole security situation is undermined? When we could work on, especially in areas of conflict, we could work on prevention and protection of women. We could work on the agency of women in contributing to peace, which is still not happening also. We know that women are still not sitting on the table enough to contribute to peace building. And at a global level, we have to, despite, if we look at the percentage of investment at the global level to the implementation of women, peace, and security plans, it is, it is less than 5% in comparison to the broad investment into other areas. And we know that still arms are flooding the region. So basically, there is an international responsibility and ethical responsibility to stop fueling conflicts in our region, to put a real investment in equitable peace, in just peace. Otherwise, we also find that some of our own communities, local communities, are questioning, why are we implementing a UNSCR resolution on the issue of women, peace, and security? Why do we feel forced that we should do that, while many UN security resolutions that are relating to peace and ending of occupation, ending of illegal settlement, as nobody is being implementing it? This is a disconnect. This is an ethical disconnect that sometimes affects our own ability as feminists and feminist movement to move forward, because sometimes we lose our own credibility when we are seen as dealing with one side of international commitments and not seeing any improvements at the other side. Again, of course, we have to see this also in the context, and then that talked about it, the issue of violence against women. If we do not, violence against women is affecting women going out to get their education, going out to work. So we cannot look at things in pigeonholed areas. If we do not have a whole all-inclusive, comprehensive approach to issues related to gender justice, political reform, and concept of social justice for all men and women, and access to equal rights, we will continue to be wasting our investment in one area and siphoning it without seeing impact at the reality and the lives of women and men in our region.
Yes, I think that's a very compelling and important point, because I think frequently one observes, at least in the Middle East, but it's not only there, of course, we see it elsewhere, that one of the weakest links in the international system currently is actually the ability to prevent or resolve conflicts. We talk a lot about conflict management. You can manage conflicts for decades without stabilizing regions. And I think the interconnections between non-violent action to resolve conflict, but also feminist thinking and action, as well as other fields of social activism, are really important to consider and to connect differently. So I thank you very much for that point. I'm seeing here on the screen a question on, could participants comment on how they see the current generation attitudes of young men and women with regards to the empowerment of women in relation to cultural, religious values? How torn do they feel about loyalty to traditional values? And I was wondering, Fatma, if you would be happy to take that question in light also of your earlier remarks on the role of women in greater knowledge production and construction, but also of not wanting to see the world through male lenses anymore in this very exclusive way that it was for a very, very long time. Would you like to comment on that particular question, on the current generation's attitudes towards the cultural religious values?
Yes, thank you. Well, I will comment on that from the perspective of what I am doing with students at the university. It is true that I have been engaged in women's rights for 3 decades, but when you talk to young students, then you have this ability to compare with previous generations. I think that more and more male students are engaging with these issues, and more of them, of course, are also struggling. But there is change. It's very small. It's very not regular, but it exists there. Now, I also want to say that after the Arab Spring, a lot of things changed. I mean, the Arabs, I call it the Arab uprisings. The uprisings in the region, actually, they involved men and women, and young people sat together, thought together, and in many cases it was women who started the whole thing. So I think that there is change and hope coming from involving men and women in the struggle. And I am against excluding any of the sexes in the contestation, in the counter contestation, and in the production of knowledge. At the level of the production and construction of knowledge, it's easier, because then you are a little bit if you want, distanced from realities. So at that level, I have never encountered big resistance, except the usual, what I was expecting. So a lot of young men are really engaged in doing that. Right now, we organized actually in Fez a conference in 2019 on Islamic feminism, and half of the participants were men. younger and older. It's also true that men were involved. Tahir Haddad was mentioned, Qasim Amin, and many men were involved in the reform, and they are still involved. So I think that the presence of men opens a vista of hope. It doesn't mean that men don't have their own agenda, that women don't have their own agenda, but in this particular moment in the history of the MENA region, it is important that both are involved, and in the Maghreb we see both of them involved.
Thank you for that very much, Fatma. It's something we can continue also to build on. I'm just looking at the other questions here up on the screen. One of them, it's actually a combination of questions saying, when talking about female-led households, is this on a single parent household? Is it a partnership, a husband or a husband-father with a disability or addiction? Does this imply that households with natural families are more wealthy? And then a follow-up question, does feminism from this point of view support traditional households, in quotation marks? Is someone encouraging / educating the mother to raise competent men and women? So of course, that's a very sort of wide-ranging and far-reaching question. So I'm checking who would actually like to address part of that. I really open the floor because I think almost every one of you has in one way or another tackled that. But maybe Randa, would you like to give a try at addressing part of that set of questions?
Actually, in the Palestinian society, around 11% of the households are headed by women. This is caused again because of and they are the most vulnerable and the poorest of the poor, because initially they have become the heading the household and taking the responsibility to provide for their families because of the husbands being either arrested or killed or being, you know, in our situation, it's again linked with the Israeli military occupation. So the households headed by women are households that are, you know, heavily depending on the contribution of women to maintaining the family, but the opportunities in the labor market are still very limited. Yes, they are the poorest of the poor, and yes, the families that are being headed either or where there are the husband and the wife working and contributing to the household, they are much better off if both of them are working. There's still the division of the labor in our society between the traditional roles of women in the household for child caring and caring generally, all the caring responsibilities and taking the household responsibilities is the major responsibility of women, because even women, when they are in the labor force, they are taking the lower jobs, the informal, being engaged in the informal sector, in working in the family businesses with being unpaid, and or in the agricultural work around the household. So it is very much linked with the traditional roles of the women within the household, rather than their ability to be able to function. Often men who have been engaged in resisting the occupation, or because of the Israeli incursions on the Gaza Strip or on the civilian population, they become persons with disabilities, and therefore women have to take over the responsibilities of the household. In a way or another, again, both this interplay between patriarchal structures and norms and the traditional roles of both men and women in our society, combined with colonial occupation and the Israeli practices against the Palestinians, really very much design or play an important role in why women taking over that role is doing that job in the way they do it, and in being the main breadwinners of the family or of the family. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Randa. I just want to check whether Asma is still on the call, because I think you said, Asma, earlier that the electricity was going to go probably. So I'm just checking. Are you still with us? Probably not in that case. I mean, there was a question up for Asma, and I just want to read it. You are an inspiration. Thank you. How engaged were fathers in the girls' education? And in your opinion, how did this impact on the child's performance? I mean, so maybe we can follow up on that a little bit later. We have a few more minutes. I have here a question that would be, I think, spoken with Osman Hibak. Would you like to raise the question? Would you unmute? Can you talk to us? You said you would like to say something.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add that, you know, the majority of the countries in the Middle East or in Africa don't have the luxury to teach boys, because when you are at war, you are raising very angry boys. So, you know, things, you know, and then, you know, the societies are going back to the tradition. So we have to keep that in mind. You don't have the luxury of actually teaching your kids. If you're spending so much time thinking what to feed them, how to educate them, how to do this and that. You don't have the time to do that. So we have to also keep that in mind, that in countries, whether it's in Palestine or Somalia or Iraq or Syria or Libya, you really have very angry men and boys. So until we stop the war, and until Europe and the United States and other countries that are manufacturing weapons stop, you know, manufacturing weapons and handing it to militias and dictators, nothing's going to happen. So I think we go back to what Selma said, and we have to stop the wars, and we have to bring peace and, you know, work towards that. But you cannot separate what's going in the country to what's going to happen, you know, to the behavior of the children, whether they're boys or girls or the whole family. So there is a family, you know, there's a disruption culturally, religiously, socially, in every which way. So let's keep that in mind.
Yes, I think that is a very important invitation to reflect on the linkages between how patriarchal traditions that go very, very far back in our history have and continue to influence us profoundly, lead not only to the discriminations and the inequalities that we see, of course, in the gender and in the race relations, but also, of course, in our tendency of many of our societies towards militarism. And it is clear that the very widespread prevalence of wars and our very weak ability for the moment still to deal with prevention strategies and conflict resolution in the current age, which is indicated by the length of average duration of conflicts around the world, is something that we should be engaging far more across areas of research and activism. I think sometimes, for very understandable reasons, there are silos that deal with these different aspects. I think their horizontal thinking, sharing of practices between feminist movements, nonviolent responses to armed conflict, resistance in a nonviolent sense to occupation and justice and others. There's a lot to learn from one another in that regard, and I think it's a very good invitation. Thanks for that important comment. We're gradually coming to the end of the time that was allocated, so I'm just having a final look at, there's one more question up here which says, I wonder how many men's support groups exist which focus on true male empowerment as feminists, while it is essential to focus on oppression, violence, and discrimination against women. If the patriarchal mindset is at the source of this, what efforts are being directed at grassroots level? So that's, I think, an important one, and I leave that for Randa. You appeared. Did you want to take the floor? Were you asking for it?
Thank you again for giving me the chance to speak. I think that yes, working with the grassroots is the key issue. Working with men and boys, as well as working with the grassroots, is very important, because from the women's feminist movement in Palestine, we have learned that if we are left alone in the forefront, patriarchal structures are really very much entrenched in our tradition, in our society. Religion is being abused in a wrong way, and therefore we are being attacked. We know very well as a feminist movement now in Palestine that working without men and boys who will support us. But again, we have patriarchal structures, very strongly entrenched. Children are being brought up in the society to take their roles in the public life, to become the controllers of the lives of their sisters and daughters in the family. We have to change all these attitudes. That's why when we talk about education, the first thing when I wanted to talk about it, I wanted to say, don't look only on the formal education system. This is very important, but how could we do that in the informal sector? We now very well know that the social media is taking over, and the traditional norms and wrong perceptions about the roles of men and women are still affecting us, and therefore we have to take over and reach out in our local communities, engage women and girls, engaging men and boys, everybody, the youth, in all our initiatives, because working alone has proven to be a failure to us as a movement. And we know very well that if we don't have new approaches to addressing these issues, we will not be able to make a lot of change. We have to emphasize the important, have many of our supporters come and join efforts with us and make them take the lead, and not us, the older generation of women or of believers in gender equality. That's one thing. Secondly, I've noticed that somebody says that feminist female movements are becoming more violent. On the contrary, that's why on the agenda of women, peace and security, we think that we want to come on the table and address issues from in a different way. We don't want to play the same rules of the game, political games. We want to bring in peace. We want to stop militarization. The feminist movement in our region believe that we suffered mostly because we have been used as a tool for war and conflicts in our region. We have been sexually abused at all levels, economically, everything, in all aspects of our life. We really want to be on the table with a different perspective. Otherwise, we want to come up with, we don't want to repeat the same rules of the game and the political game that we see now. And that's why we think that we, being on the table, we want to bring something different to the table. That's what we think, and that's why we believe in what Selma said about the women, peace and security agenda and a just solution for us, the Palestinians of our conflict, but also we want to see a different governing leadership in our region in order to make real change. And we want to see democracy being entrenched, and real democracy, meaningful democracy.
Thank you so much, Randa. That's a very, very nice way of bringing this session to a close. And I just want to flag that, Dr. Murji, it would be very good to have your presentation so that we can look at that data, because it would have deserved more time in this session as well. There really isn't a possibility to summarize now, and no need, by the way, because much has been said by our speakers with passion, depth, and commitment. So there really isn't anything I want to add. Maybe just two very small remarks. Also from a male perspective, this is part of learning and engagement with you on these topics. I think this is also a time for us as men to come on board of your thinking and your acting, and to not limit the actions that have been taken in recent years to some of the tactical adjustments and adaptations to the feminist message, to women's struggles and the aspirations to equal rights, but to really come on board and to join your invitation, Randa and Salma, Fatma and Asma. Fauzi, you have also mentioned this. I think these are very important, inclusive joining together so that we all change, and in particular also on the male side, learn and change. I was very inspired and very fortunate in my years with UNRWA to have worked in close connection with many female students. I just want to pay tribute to them. Palestine refugee students, also in Syria, for example. I never forget young Batul, born in Yarmouk camp, who actually had to flee the camp with her parents after it was destroyed, and then on her way to Lebanon, lost her father and one of her brothers. The trauma that meant, of course, and she ended up being in a school in Lebanon, an UNRWA school, where she was the highest performing student. I think nobody can really explain how one draws so much energy, strength, and determination out of that level of trauma at a young age in one's life. But Batul, as every other young student from any of the countries affected by war in the region, deserves not just our recognition, does not deserve just our expressions of hope for a better future, but our engagement to change the circumstances that are leading to these conflict dynamics and to the inequalities that you have also compellingly described in this presentation. I want to take this opportunity to thank and recognize Salma Nims, Fatma Saliki, Azma Mustafa, Randa Signora, and Fauzi Murji, thanking you in the name of all the participants for these very remarkable presentations and exchanges. And Jubin, I hand it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. We will now take a well-deserved break from 11:30 to 11:45. So we'll see you again soon. Thank you.